This is Chthonia, the world of the dark feminine. Hello, this is Breach Burke. Before we get into this week's podcast, I would like to thank my patrons personally: Gwyn K, Polity, John H, Tanya T, Veronica S, Jeffrey B, Gabby, Helen M, Sunny H, Scott K, JRM, Susie G, Eldritch Priest, B. Lupita, C. Roberts, Jeanette, DS, Jake B, CDV, Ali, Thaddeus G, V!V, Mary Beth R, Ida B, Eric N, Tana, and May. I really appreciate those of you who have joined recently and who have stuck with me over these years. Our community is small, and there is so much I would like to do in terms of providing courses, conversation on the dark feminine, and extra content. So please consider joining at patreon.com/Chthonia. Now on to the podcast. Hello and welcome to Chthonia, the podcast that deals with the dark feminine. I'm Breach Burke, and our topic this week comes not directly out of the political climate, because one thing I would like to really skirt for the most part in this podcast and in other ones is politics itself. But I just find it interesting lately, just as I had spoken in my live stream that I did this past Monday about the name Kamala. Okay, since we know Kamala Harris they're going to call her the presumptive nominee. We don't actually know yet that she's going to be the nominee for the Dems. I mean, it's looking that way, but we don't actually know. In any case, we do know that Joe Biden stepped down and that she stepped up. And so there has been a whole lot of, it's very interesting when you have a woman who steps up for a position of power, regardless of what your opinion is of her. When you see somebody step up like that, especially when the challenger is somebody who has definitely a more authoritarian kind of a bent, somebody who wants power. Then the dynamic that plays out, you see a script and a narrative that starts to play out, and it's fascinating to watch, because I'm like, it's the same one. Because literally, if people were not talking about her race and things about her race, there was this whole thing. I literally saw somebody refer to her as the character we're going to talk about today, and that is Jezebel. So now that's the reason why she's going to be the topic of this week's podcast. This is why I feel like the need to talk about Jezebel, because Jezebel has the first, and maybe not really the first, but the first or one of the older examples that we think of from literature, and I consider the Bible as literature in this way of thinking, or mythological literature, where we see this particular archetype of a queen, particularly the archetype of the wicked queen. And this is a motif that we see repeated. There's the historical Jezebel. There is the story that is told in the Book of Kings in the Bible, first Book of Kings. And there is the associations that people have had with Jezebel in writings, Christian writings, the way that she appears in literature, the way that she appears in drama, the kinds of portrayals of Jezebel and what that name has come to be associated with is fascinating. And what I think it may mean I'm going to just talk about it in the broadest terms. I'll probably just make a mention of it in this context, but I probably don't need to talk a whole lot about that, because I think it'll become somewhat apparent as to what we're looking at here. So the way that I want to structure this particular episode, I'm going to tell you what the story is in the Bible. Now, I was going to read it directly from Kings, but as I'm reading through it, it's like, and thus said this one, and this said that one, and this, and it's just, it would be very confusing, and you'd probably lose track very quick. I found myself losing track, and I've read it before, and I'm like, okay, this is a little. I think I prefer to read something that's a little bit more summarized in terms of the actual story. So we're going to talk about the Bible stories about Jezebel, okay, who she is, where she comes from. We're going to talk a little bit about the historicity of Jezebel, like what is known about her historically. Some of her other associations, for example, she's considered to be the aunt of Queen Dido, who we see in the Aeneid, and who is the queen of Carthage. And that association is also somewhat interesting. I do also want to talk about Jezebel as a sovereign and how she compares to other well-known sovereigns. The example I'm probably going to use is Queen Maeve. Now, again, there's no relationship between Queen Maeve and Jezebel. We're not suggesting that there's a mythological connection or anything like that. But in terms of their roles as sovereign and what they represent, I think there's an interesting similarity to compare or contrast there a little bit. And we are going to talk a little bit about queens and how they functioned, certainly in that Mesopotamian region in the Near East. What it was like for a woman who was queen, who actually held power, not a queen who was the wife of the king, the one who was more or less submissive to her husband. And that submission factor is really one of the keys that we're going to see here in these kinds of narratives. So then we're going to go on and talk about the associations with Jezebel as a result of this story. And then we're going to end by talking a little bit about what I call, I'm not the one who calls it, this is actually the way it's discussed, the virgin whore axis. Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit about that. So let's start by talking about the Jezebel story. So first of all, who is she? She is the daughter of Ithabel. She is from Phoenicia. She's a Phoenician royalty. And Ithabel I of Tyre, and she was married to Ahab, the king of Israel, according to the Book of Kings. And we're looking probably the region of about 900 BCE, somewhere around there, maybe a little earlier. Now, I'm just going to read this from Wikipedia. We'll just see this get the summary up front. According to the biblical narrative, Jezebel replaced Yahwism, which is worship of Yahweh or Jehovah, which is what we associate Judaism with Baal and Asherah worship. Okay, now I have done a podcast on Asherah, and I can refer you back to that one to talk more about Baal and who Baal is and the connection to Baal. Certainly, these were Canaanite deities. Okay, and she was responsible for Naboth's death, and apparently the death also of many Yahwist prophets. And it says, this caused irreversible damage to the reputation of the Omride dynasty, who was already unpopular among the Israelites. For these offenses, Jezebel was defenestrated. Okay, she was actually she was thrown out a window and devoured by dogs under the orders of Jehu, which Elijah prophesied. Okay, and Elijah was her enemy in this, who came up against her, and we'll talk about that. Now it says, later in the book of Revelation, the name Jezebel is contemptuously attributed to a prophetic woman of Thyatira, whom the author, through the voice of the risen Christ, accuses of leading her followers into fornication, which is actually, in this case, a code word for idolatry. It's not literally about leading them into sex, but in leading them into a kind of idolatry that is against what the against what would be Yahwism, really. For refusing to repent, she is threatened with sexual domination, humiliation, and the death of her children. Okay, so this is all really quite interesting. So let's... Okay, again, my mind is already just spinning with the archetypal kind of references here. It says, Jezebel is the anglicized transliteration of the Hebrew Isabel. And it says that the name is best understood as meaning, where is the Lord? And it's a ritual cry that from worship ceremonies in honor of Baal during periods of the year when the god was considered to be in the underworld. So her name is basically the cry for Baal during the winter months when he is not, as the kind of the life of the fields is now in the underworld and not present. It says, alternatively, a feminine Punic name noted by the Corpus Inscriptionum Semiticarum in Phoenician, they showed the Phoenician here, may have been a cognate to the original form of the name, as the Israelites were known to alter personal names which invoked the names of foreign gods. So, for instance, for Baal, they would have done, Mephibosheth and Ishbosheth. They were just giving some examples of how they do that. Right, so if it had the name of a foreign god, if the person was named for a foreign god, they would alter that name. Now, he says, Jezebel is introduced into the biblical narrative as a Phoenician princess, daughter of Ithabel I, king of Tyre, in the first book of Kings, chapter 16, verse 31. It says she was Sidonian, which is a biblical term for Phoenicians in general. According to the genealogies given by Josephus, that would be Flavius Josephus, the same author for whom we have probably the only written reference to Christ, and literally as Christus. The other classical and other classical sources, she was the great aunt of Dido, queen of Carthage. As the daughter of Ithabal I, she was also the sister of Baal Esher II. Jezebel eventually married King Ahab of Samaria, the northern kingdom of Israel. Okay, so it's interesting. Yeah, we have to think about the fact that Samaria and Jerusalem, they were like competing cities. Samaria is the one that always tended to have the more negative reputation. And certainly we see this in the New Testament when Jesus tells the story of the Good Samaritan, because Samaritans were considered to be, they were... There's a lot in Judaism around correct ritual, obedience to ritual, obedience to the covenant, and these kinds of requirements that are talked about that have to do with Yahweh and that are connected to Yahweh, and Samaria is considered to be this sort of this outlier. Yeah, you see this a lot throughout Judaic history. You see it in the Bible, in different parts, and then the Bible. It's funny. I was thinking the other day. I said, "What's like my 10-word version of what the Old Testament is about?" And it's basically Israelites trying not to piss off Yahweh. I mean, that's pretty much the entirety of the Old Testament. And so it's and every aspect of it has to do with that, or what happens to the Israelites when they piss off Yahweh. So that's really the text. It's just trying, and a lot of it. So even a lot of the rules and things that we see, like in Leviticus and Deuteronomy and things, this is a Deuteronomic type text. It's certainly been edited that way, and this was about the Babylonian captivity, when they're overthrown, when they have a foreign ruler, and this is a period of time when they sit down and they actually review what their laws are, or they write certain things down. And so, so this was the period of time in which they tried to say, we've lost our sovereignty. Well, what did we do wrong? Well, let's go make a whole new list of rules that we're going to follow, or maybe we're going to revive old rules because, we've all done all these things that Yahweh doesn't like, because they're like the practices of our neighbors towards other gods, and that first commandment, I shall have no other gods before me. So there's this whole thing of like, well, we obviously didn't do it right, so now this is what we're going to do. And I always feel that people need to read Leviticus and Deuteronomy in that context, not as a rule book for how people should be behaving in the modern world. That's an aside, but. Okay, let's go back. So anyway, the Samaritans, Jesus talks about the parable of the Good Samaritan, and this is when you have the people who are, the priest and the person of high rank and the wealthy person who walks by the man who has been beaten by robbers and left to die on the side of the road, and the one man who stops to come and help him is from Samaria. He's a Samaritan, and of course they were considered to be, you didn't associate with Samaritans if you were a good. Probably if you were like in the kind of the Pharisee side of the house, like if you were very, very orthodox and pious Jew, you did not associate with them. So Jesus' parable is saying, yes, but who is the one who was actually the good person here? The people who were the good people didn't do anything. The Samaritan is the one who actually came in and helped. And there's also the idea of Jesus taking well water from Samaritan women as well, which is interesting. It's interesting how he tries to sort of connect with that part of Judah, part of of Israel, I should say, that northern kingdom that is, that is not that was later considered to be kind of an outcast place, so to speak. Anyway, I'm just noting that in my mind because certainly King Ahab lived in Samaria and was from Samaria, and this is where the Baalist altars were set up. So, okay. So, there's some people who propose that, I think it mentions Near Eastern scholar Charles Kramelkov proposed that Psalm 45 records the wedding ceremony of Ahab and Jezebel, but other scholars cast doubt on this association. The marriage was a culmination of friendly relations between Israel and Phoenicia during Omri's reign, and possibly cemented important political designs of Ahab. Jezebel, like the foreign wives of Solomon, required facilities for carrying on her form of worship, so Ahab made a Baalist altar in the house of Baal, which he had built in Samaria. Now, that's kind of an important thing to think about here, because when you're trying to make a political marriage, an alliance with another people, and you're not just staying within the boundaries of your own country, and you happen to practice a religion which was very unusual at the time in the sense that they had their own, they were henotheists. Let me backtrack on that. The Jews were henotheists. So while Yahweh was the chief deity of the Israelites, and while Yahweh, really strictly speaking, didn't like other deities, like altars being set up to other deities, then there was still a fair amount of polytheism that was being practiced at that time. It was not, Canaanite religion was very much mixed in with Israelite religion. So the idea that this was this woman just, in the way that we think about it when we think of the Maccabean revolt, when the emperor comes in and the new king who has taken over comes in and basically lays waste to the temple and wants to install statues of Zeus. Where we're not really talking about that period of history. We're talking about a period of history where it wasn't really uncommon. In fact, there's this idea of Baalist versus Yahwist altars. Okay, the idea that Baal and other Canaanite deities were certainly still worshipped at that time. And the way that you would read the Bible, you would assume that wasn't going on, but it most certainly was. And actually, there's a lot of, the Bible is not just a narrative of how everybody is obedient to Yahweh and you get the one bad apple now and again, so to speak. The culture was way more complex than that. But, okay. So then it says, Jeffrey Bromley points out that it was a Phoenician practice to install a royal woman as priestess of Astarte, and thus she would have a more active role in temple and palace relations than was customary in the Hebrew monarchy. Yes, and that's the other thing too. It's a little bit more patriarchal, and the queen is somebody, while somebody respected, is considered to be more submissive to her spouse, to her royal spouse. Now, you will see this throughout the writings, even in the Roman period. Again, Ctesias comes to mind, and some of the others who talk about these queens Sumerian queens, Babylonian queens. And again, this cheese coming from Phoenicia, places that are associated with Canaanite religion and so forth. And again, we actually see this throughout the world. We have the idea of the female sovereign, and the female sovereign she's not just a passive little figure, getting her nails done and, her makeup and just sitting there on the throne looking royal and pretty, and deferring to her husband. You might even get that impression from Greek mythology, but if we think about Hera in Greek mythology, okay, if we think of Zeus as a king of the gods, as representing that archetype of royalty, I mean, we see that Hera she can be actually quite ruthless, right, in the way that she behaves. She still yields to her husband, but she's quite ruthless. But these Babylonian queens, and especially if they were the queens in their own right, where they didn't have a king, if they were the sole sovereign, they could be just as ruthless as what we tend to think of as a tyrant or a king. There's the stories of women, and they're no question they'll go out and they'll have their enemies killed. There was one Babylonian queen, and I don't have the source with me anymore, otherwise I would look it up, but she had, this was in the writings of Ctesias, and she would, and again, and some people will try to say, oh, well, this is just them trying to make her look bad. I'm like, no, I'm pretty sure they were probably like this. I mean, not that I was there, but at the same time, I don't have any reason to doubt this just because they were female. They would bring in the most handsome warriors, have sex with them, and then kill them. I mean, stuff like that. I mean, you would hear about stuff like this, okay? So, so the idea that they were women, we always assume that these women were always submissive and had to yield to their spouses, and you're not really seeing that. A lot of the women were just as powerful as the men, sometimes more so in some cases. So, in any case, certainly, Jezebel comes from a place where the royal females certainly have as much power and prestige as the royal males. And like I said, she's marrying into a Hebrew kingdom, and that may not have been the case So naturally, she already is not really looked upon very favorably just from that vantage point. Okay, so moving on with this. Her coronation as queen upset the balance of power between Yahwism and Baalism. As queen, Jezebel institutionalized Baalism and killed Yahwist prophets, which most likely included the priests of Jeroboam's golden calf cult, and desecrated their altars. Obadiah, a pro-Yahwist figure in Ahab's royal court, secretly protected the survivors of these purges in a cave. Some commentators observed that Jezebel's desecration of Yahwist altars would have normally been condoned since they were built outside of Jerusalem, which contravened the Deuteronomic code. However, they were overlooked due to Elijah's piety or Jezebel's quote-unquote improper motives. Alternatively, scholars argue that the Deuteronomic code promotes laicization and considers all of Israel to be Yahweh's sacred space. Theologians likewise argue that the sacred space is any place where Yahweh manifested to humans according to Exodus 20:24. Okay, so yeah. In other words, some people have argued that because those Yahwist altars were outside of Jerusalem, outside of the proper place, that they needed to be destroyed, that nobody had any business setting up altars in those places. But then others will argue and they'll say, well, no, all of Israel belongs to Yahweh and people can put up an altar anywhere. That's sort of the rationale here. Okay, so as a result, Elijah invited Jezebel's prophets of Baal and Asherah to a challenge at Mount Carmel. Adam Clarke believes they were royal chaplains and that the Baalist prophets had more jurisdiction over Samaria during Jezebel's reign than the Asherah prophets, who were always indigenous to Samaria. The challenge was to see which god, Yahweh or Baal, would burn a bull sacrifice on an altar. Jezebel's prophets failed to summon Baal in burning the bull sacrifice, despite their cries and cutting themselves. I have a funny side story about that, but just let me finish this first. Elijah, however, succeeded when he summoned Yahweh, impressing the Israelites. He then ordered the people to seize and kill the prophets of Baal and Asherah at the Kishon River. In response, Jezebel vows to kill Elijah. Elijah fled to Mount Horeb, where he mourned the apostasy of Israel. Okay, so really we've got this religious battle that is also a very highly political one and has to do with the challenges that are being made to the sovereign. I just need to note something right now. Quickly, there's a thunderstorm coming in right now, and it is on Lunasa that I'm recording this. So this is an incredibly auspicious omen because the thunderstorm on Lunasa is a sign of Lug's presence. Is actually what it is, that he's going to take down the great Eye of Belor. But anyway, that's a completely different mythology. But I was just noting it because I don't think they were particularly expecting storms today. But I see that one is coming in, so I just think that's really great. So anyway, and my other side story, really quick, this is just a funny story. When I was an undergraduate, one of my science professors had talked about a friend of hers who had a cat whose name was Baal, named after the Canaanite god Baal. And there is a piece. Now, I don't remember who the composer is, but there is a symphonic piece that is... that is basically a kind of a classical recreation with orchestra and voices and everything of this particular scene. And apparently, in the house there was somebody was playing this on a record player. This is how long ago it was. But they were playing a record of this, and there's a point at which the chorus says, "Baal, hear and answer," and then you have this silence, right? And they keep saying, "Baal, hear and answer." However, in that house, the cat was sitting there, and when they would go, "Baal, hear and answer," the cat would just meow. He just piped up each time, and I said, "Well, there you go. There's the cat answering for Baal," but the cat's name was Baal. That was just, I just always thought that was really funny. It's like, and there was no response. It's like, but yes, there was. There was this one cat. So anyway, I always thought that story was funny, and I could actually just it would be like an Instagram moment at this time, or something that you'd put on TikTok at this point in time, right? Anyway, okay, so now moving on with the story. After these events, Ben-Hadad, the king of Aram Damascus, besieged Israel and threatened to capture Ahab's wives, including Jezebel. Ahab refused and defeated him in battle. However, he spared Ben-Hadad's life, an act that was denounced by an unnamed prophet. The prophet also declared that Israel would be ravaged by the Arameans as punishment. Okay, and then the next incident involves Naboth, who has a vineyard that is adjacent to the palace of Jezebel and Ahab. And it says in 855 to 856 BCE, roughly, Jezebel resolved a failed business deal between Ahab and a civilian named Naboth concerning a vineyard. To do this, she ordered the execution of Naboth and his sons under false charges of blasphemy against God and the king. Commentators observed that the execution was performed according to biblical guidelines, so suspicions of foul play could be minimized. After Naboth's death, his corpse was licked by stray dogs. His execution was criticized by Elijah, who prophesied doom for Jezebel's family as a punishment. And it's interesting, because Naboth basically, when they say we would like to, buy the vineyard from you or exchange, he said, the law says I cannot give away the inheritance of my father. This is why Naboth does not want to yield the property. And so Jezebel kind of does this manipulative kind of arrangement, and of course he gets the property, but the man is killed. And it's interesting because when Elijah comes to Ahab about this, Ahab actually is penitent, and he rips his clothes and he puts sackcloth and ashes, and and Yahweh says to Elijah, he says, "Well, you see how Ahab humbled himself before me." He says, "So I'm not going to smite him, but when his sons come in, he says, I'm going to smite them instead." So very interesting, this whole idea of, the sins of the father, right? This idea of this kind of succession that comes in. When we talk about things, the sins of the fathers being, visited on the children. And if I go back to the Zeus and Hera comparison, I think about the fact that when Zeus, goes around with other women and has children with them, oftentimes Hera is not only going after the woman, but also goes after the children as well. There's this whole thing about going after the descendants, because, and I think this has a lot to do with the fact that this has to do with the immortality of the line. If there's a corruption, it ends up destroying the line farther down, again, this being your chance at immortality. You have to remember that the Hebrews / Israelites at this point are also, they're not believers in eternal life. They believe that when you pass away, you go to Sheol. A very similar belief to what other people believe. And again, your lineage, your immortality is through your lineage and your family and things like that. So to go after the family means that they are sort of, in a certain sense, snuffing out your immortality to some degree. There's definitely an element of that is there. And of course, we see in Greek myths when you have things like cannibalism, incest, and other, big corruptions that end up completely destroying a family line at the end, like we see in the Oresteia, or like we see in... what was the other one? In the Theban saga, in the saga of Thebes, and the way that these things happen. So 3 years later, Ahab dies in battle. Jezebel's son, Ahaziah, inherited the throne, but died as a result of an accident and was succeeded by his brother, Jehoram. Jehu later usurped the throne and killed Jehoram and his nephew, Ahaziah, who was the son of Jehoram's possible sister, Athaliah, and her Judahite husband, Jehoram. Trying to get through these names. He later approached Jezebel at the royal palace in Jezreel. Anticipating his arrival, Jezebel put on makeup and a formal wig with adornments and looked out of a window and taunted him. Bromley says that it should be looked less as an attempt of seduction and more as a public defiance of the Queen Mother, invested with the authority of the royal house and cult to confront a rebellious commander. Yes, and this is the actual thing that gives Jezebel the... when people refer to a woman, at least one of the associations with Jezebel has to be with her as being like a prostitute, or being some kind of like a whore type of a woman. And if you see, I've heard the expression of girls who put on too much makeup. You're trying to look like a Jezebel, but she's not trying to seduce him. That's not what she's there for. She's putting on all of her regal feminine power to confront him. But Jehu has her eunuchs pick her up and throw her out the window, defenestrated, thrown out the window. And then eventually, by the time they go to bury her, the dogs have actually eaten of her body, which is what Elijah had prophesied. And it basically says that Asimov, in his Guide to the Bible, says that her last act of dressing in all of her finery, makeup, and jewelry as deliberately symbolic, indicating her dignity, royal status, and determination to go out of this life as a queen. And so, so they said that she died roughly around 850 BCE. So yes, this was definitely a period of time when Israel was not, even though Yahweh was their main deity, he was by far not the only one. Now, so let's move on to the historiosity here. It says, according to Israel Finkelstein, the marriage of Ahab to the daughter of the ruler of the Phoenician Empire was a sign of power and prestige of Ahab and the northern kingdom of Israel. He termed it a brilliant stroke of international diplomacy. He said inconsistencies and anachronisms in the Bible stories of Jezebel and Ahab mean that they must be considered more of a historical novel than an accurate historical chronicle. Among these inconsistencies, the first book of Kings, verse 20, states that Ben-Hadad, king of Aram, invaded Samaria during Ahab's reign, but this event did not take place until later in the history of Israel, and Ben-Hadad, in inverted commas and quotes, was the title of the ruler of Aram Damascus. Finkelstein also states that the biblical accounts are obviously influenced by the theology of 7th century BCE writers. They were hostile to polytheism and viewed Samaria as a rival to Jerusalem. Okay. So, and it's been noted by some of the other writers. So it says that the authors of the Book of Kings was drawing on earlier sources. The book mixes the annals of history with legends, folk tales, miracle stories, and fictional constructions, and presentation of earlier sources heavily edited to fit the Deuteronomist agenda. Kind of back to what I'm saying there. It says that, there's a lot about the narrative that we see as implausible. We don't see Naboth being betrayed by an entire Israelite town. It says, Christian Frevel argues that the biblical narrative subtly alludes to the Omrides' historical role in introducing Yahwism to Judah, which was obfuscated by the anti-Omride Judeans. For example, Ahab gave his children theophoric names during his years of expansion in the northern territories and Judah. Other scholars propose that the Baal worshipped by Ahab and Jezebel was the Yahweh of Samaria, which was opposed as Yahwist heresy by the Judean priests, but some disagree based on archaeological evidence and extra-biblical records on Jezebel's upbringing. Brian R. Doak believes that the narratives are historically plausible because of the historiosity of Omri and Ahab. Evidence for widespread paganism among the Israelites, international marriages for political purposes, and competition between religious professionals during periods of political unrest or social change. In addition, other contemporary sources, including sources written by Phoenicians, face similar issues in terms of being unverified by third-party sources. Okay, so there's some other things about some other symbols that have been found, royal seals and things like that, and there's speculation as to whether or not they had something to do with Jezebel. Okay, so we're looking at the historiosity here. Okay, so what we see here is we see Jezebel as being this. I mean, she's this queen, she's this powerful queen. She actually, everything that she does is really in line with what what sovereigns tended to do. And certainly when you were talking about theocratic establishments, which, is not limited to the Israelites in any way, shape, or form, you would see the rituals of the different gods certainly tied to the state and to the health of the state. There's nothing about her that's particularly unusual. She's not. Now you can argue that again you've got this political bent because you have the people of Judah, of the southern Israel, who do not like the Samaritans of northern Israel, and there's this kind of there's almost like this competition and this disparity, but it's not, but it's couched often in the Bible as being something that, it's because they were against the Lord Yahweh, and Yahweh came and spoke to Elijah, and basically indicated that they were wrong. Basically, it's a violation of that first commandment. Okay. But you have to remember it in the context of the fact these were a people who, even though Yahweh was their central deity, were certainly worshiping other deities at that time. And again, you can make arguments about what that means, but when you have Yahweh in the context, you're not looking at Yahweh as the one, now people tend to automatically associate Yahweh with being the one true God, but that's not actually how he was conceived then. And so it tends to be like, oh, look at all these bad people who are not worshiping the one true God. And that's the way it has been spun. But by no means what's going on there was that anything, basically from a political and cultural standpoint, was there anything that weird and unusual, even about what Jezebel did. Now, I wanted to draw some comparisons between Jezebel and Queen Maeve, because Maeve is also from the stories. Now, I've done a podcast on her as well, And the reason I want to draw a comparison to Maeve is because Maeve is another strong female sovereign. Now, she will have a king, but she was the one who was the kingmaker. She was the one who would make the choice about who her husband was going to be, or husbands plural. See, here we have a different situation. Jezebel is one wife among King Ahab's wives, because remember when Ben-Hadad threatens to come and take his things, he's going to take the most beautiful of his wives. Right, so we're not talking wife singular. Jezebel. Now it's possible she might have been the main royal concubine, but she apparently did wield a lot of political power, and we also see if they refer back to King Solomon, and of course the Queen of Sheba, and of course now it's interesting because the Queen of Sheba narrative in connection to Jezebel. If I can just divert over to that for a moment, in both cases. You have kings of Israel who are being diverted into worship of a different deity. Okay, Queen of Sheba has him crush some grasshoppers or something as a sacrifice to Moloch. Okay, and to King Solomon, and of course Yahweh leaves King Solomon at that point, according to the biblical narrative. Here we have Ahab, who is married to Jezebel, and he. And again, but it's just very interesting because it's almost like Baal and Yahweh are very close or very similar enough that building an altar to Asherah, and in remember if you look at the Asherah podcast, there's some people who believe Asherah was the spouse of Yahweh at some point. There's a lot of kind of overlap and syncretism, probably in the early Israelite kingdom in history, that gets glossed over a bit as the biblical texts kind of change everything to make it just strictly about Yahweh or Jehovah or however you want to say that name. Of course, again, I've said before, a good observant Jew would not say Yahweh or Jehovah. They would say Adonai or something like that. Or a lot of times I've had a lot of Jewish friends who will write God, but it'll be G space D. So they don't. It's not considered proper to actually just say the name. We just say it indiscriminately. But you wouldn't have that of somebody who is an observant Jew because the name is incredibly sacred. Although anyone who was involved in any kind of esoteric practices or Kabbalistic practices or just general Western esotericism knows that there are lots of names for God. Or at least for that version of God. So okay, so. Yeah, I was talking about Queen Maeve. Now, in the stories of Queen Maeve, I mean, we have her, killing her own sister and basically giving a C-section and cutting the nephew out of her body. We see her, we just see her engaged in all kinds of activities where she is being portrayed as just kind of ruthless and vicious in the way that she behaves. And of course, again, later writers will try to say, well, yes, but the Christian writers did that deliberately just to make her look like a bad person. And it's like, no, this is the way that a sovereign is supposed to behave. If you are a sovereign, you are the ruler, you are the one that establishes the boundaries, you are the one that lays down the law. As I've said, the word ruler, like if we think about a ruler that you would take, like a 12-inch ruler or a 30-centimeter ruler, or a yardstick or meter stick or whatever you're using, what do we use that? You use that to measure. You establish the length of something. How long is this thing? We use the ruler to determine, right? And so there's a mathematical ruler, but there's a reason we call it that is because it does have this connection to the idea of a ruler as a king or a sovereign, because we also refer to a king as a ruler, right, or a queen. They're the ruler in the sense that they set the boundaries, and they are sovereign within those boundaries. They make the laws. They are subject to certain, maybe rules, certain taboos, or certain things that are limitations of their office. And depending on how that role of king or queen is interpreted, that may mean different things for the sovereign. But the sovereign is there. One of the things the sovereign is there to do is to defend the territory and to keep people unified to some degree. So the idea that a queen who is in charge, especially when you have a lot of these great warriors or very, very ruthless kind of people, she has to be somebody who is formidable in her own way. Okay, she has to have a formidable kind of power to be able to to do this, because even if it was a male king, you would be getting a lot of challenges from the outside. And a lot of times these challenges have a lot to do with warlike strength. So the idea of a queen who's just going to be very soft and very nice and very, like, oh, her enemies come in, but, we'll just have a nice talking to, and then, I'll give them, you do something that gives them a little slap on the wrist and they go away. No, it doesn't work like that. They have to be ruthless, because that in addition to the rules that they've established, this is the way that they protect and defend their territory. Now, we can talk about that psychologically and what that would be as a psychological motif, what it means when people set up those barriers, put a fortress around themselves. In a certain sense, actually, there's been a lot of discussion recently of people who follow my other live stream, which is Transition Life Coaching on Instagram. It's Morning Coffee with Breege is what it's called. But one of the things we talk about in terms of certain healing modalities that I work through is the idea of vulnerability and the idea of opening the heart, and where true strength actually comes from having an open heart. It's much harder to open your heart than it is to be ruthless, to just say, F off everybody, and I'm closed off, and if you come near me, I'll attack. It's actually much easier to do that. Once you've gotten past the shame of, maybe I shouldn't behave this way, you're just like, everybody just bugger off. And there's a certain freedom in that. I think women, especially when they are feeling empowered, and maybe men too. But it's just when you feel that sense of freedom and empowerment, it's that I don't give a damn, right? Hey, I don't care what you think. Go away. It's that kind of a thing. But allowing yourself to be free while still being vulnerable and open is a very, very difficult thing to do. And we see this kind of tradition with rulers. One of the things that's been said about power, political power, the power of the sovereign, is that a lot of time that power has to be maintained through a kind of ruthlessness. But if you're too ruthless with your subjects, then they want to overthrow you. Okay, there is the tyrant comes from a word that literally just means ruler. But the thing is, it's become associated with a ruler who is especially cruel. Yeah, tyrannous. It has to do with this idea of somebody who is ruthless in some way, whether in fact that person is ruthless or not. You know what I mean? It doesn't, there's a certain amount of, if we see a king who is just too soft and just too benevolent, eventually that person might rule harmoniously for a certain period of time, but then at some point there's going to be somebody who's going to come in with a political challenge. Kind of reminds me of the things that we do, the great apes do too, when one is trying to gain dominance, okay? When somebody's trying to dominate the group or dominate the tribe. It's this kind of behavior that we have. But generally, when you're talking about a society that supposedly has brought into rationality and deeper thinking and deeper consciousness of things, the idea is that one should be able to rule peaceably, be able to maintain a kingdom, fighting to maintain what they need to when necessary, but generally speaking, being benevolent and being beloved by people, because that is another way to rule. Everybody loves you so much that nobody would kill you, but then you have to worry about people from the outside who might come in and see what the nice thing that you have and then attack you. So it's interesting, when we talk about being a sovereign for a nation versus being a sovereign, personal sovereign for yourself. And I don't know, there just seems to be a lot these days about heart opening. A lot of the ways that our societies are ruled today aren't necessarily with an open heart. Certainly, I feel like that's a shift that I have been seeing, especially as people shift harder to the right, because one of the aspects of shifting farther and farther to the right is definitely a more authoritarian and a more controlling stance. And that is a stance that basically it's that Iron Fortress stance. It's the one that says, it's my way or the highway, really. I'm laying the rules down, and this is how it's going to be, and you get on board, or you're going to be, whatever the penalty is for not following along. And but again, we're used to societies where the idea is that you need to be open, that you need to be a little more vulnerable. So this comes up actually at an interesting time when we're talking about vulnerability, right? Now, Jezebel, whether or not she was also a vulnerable woman, I don't know. It sounds to me like, the only accounts that we have, they do suggest she was ruthless, that she got rid of a lot of Yahwist prophets, that she had them killed. And that in the case of this Naboth, that she actually, that she did this by some kind of a, manipulation. It was very, very backhanded, the way that she managed this. Which again, that indirectness of the feminine, but using that kind of indirectness to achieve some kind of a strategic end. And these are all things that are kind of part of this, this art of war and this art of conflict. And they have to do with matters of the heart, but they also do with ways in which one closes off from the matters of the heart as well. I don't know. It's something that I think about with regard to that. But Jezebel comes across as somebody who is, she is acting according to her role. She is acting in line with what her role is, and perhaps what she feels she would have felt her role should be as a queen, based on the culture and the community that she came from. Now, this does, and again, Queen Maeve also, she was going to maintain her sovereignty. She was powerful, but see, her power was not only in the fact that her prowess with her war and with her with in war, or with her possessions and with things like that. It was also her beauty. She was apparently like wildly magnetic and wildly seductive, and so that is a form of feminine power that is often feared, either hated or feared. Okay, and it can be. And oftentimes that fact that the woman has that kind of seductive quality, or has that very powerful and fearless kind of a countenance, makes other people look at her as, in other words, somebody who is not going to submit. Okay? Submission really is everything here. She is the dominant one. She's not going to submit to her spouse, even if her spouse is the king. So it's interesting in the way that this is conceived of. Now, there was I was looking up some articles on this, and one of these was from somebody, just says, a speaker, just M. Firth, doesn't tell me what the first name is, College of Humanities, Arts, and Social Sciences at, this is a Flinders University. I don't know if this is just, but in any case, there's an abstract that came up here that talks about the archetype of the wicked queen. So I'm just going to read a little bit from this description because I think it's interesting in terms of its context. It says, the motif of the wicked queen is an intercultural literary archetype with ancient precedents. Jezebel's persecution of Elijah, Herodias seeking the head of John the Baptist, rumors that Livia Drusilla poisoned Augustus, of Theodora's sexual promiscuity. Such allegations are rarely supported by historical evidence, more often serving political interests, usually after the subject's death, and demonstrating an inherent social misogyny and discomfort with women exercising power. Jan Zielkowski identifies this trope, primarily invested in the person of Jezebel, as one that becomes particularly prevalent in Latin hagiography throughout the early medieval period. Thus, for example, powerful women such as Brunhilda of Austrasia and the Italian queen consort Willa are termed second Jezebels by hagiographers and historians representing views of opposing political factions. Yeah, and to that point, again, the idea of kind of denigrating Samaria as being apostates with respect to Judah, this kind of infighting that goes on. And again, there's always been this whole thing about, especially when you have priests who are rulers, or when you have the idea of the kings and the priests kind of being working together for political power, you will have this infighting that can go on. And it ends up becoming about, there becomes this infighting that then ends up taking on a religious tone as to who is the one who is righteous and who is the one who is the apostate, or who is the one who is the sinful or the fallen one, in terms of how that comes across. And so the writer goes on, says, this is a technique used by hagiographers writing the lives of England's pre-conquest saints. In this context, most often royal women who found themselves in conflict with a person who would later be designated a saint that are most vulnerable to accusations of being a wicked queen. Now, it's interesting because the wicked queen archetype, okay, if we think about the dark queen, It says in patriarchal retellings, I'm just taking this from a couple of different places, but it says she's a threat, usually to an inexperienced and innocent female counterpart. Okay? So, yeah, now if we think about Jezebel's associations, she's associated with false prophets, right? So the contest of Elijah between Yahweh and Baal, who would create the Holocaust of the bull sacrifice. And Holocaust here, by the way, just means, since people have that association of that term with a specific incident, it just literally means a fire, or burning something up, creating a fire. So she's associated with these false prophets. She's associated with women who are quote-unquote fallen. In her case, literally fallen, because she fell out a window. A pagan masquerading as a servant of God was often considered to be a Jezebel. And also, it's a term that is used a lot of times. And again, this is all within sort of Christian type writing or polemic, as a woman who is too controlling is considered to be a Jezebel. Now, we have to think about all of the associations that we see there. We see sexual ones. We see an idea of falseness. If we think about, going back to Revelation, I mean, yes, there's a mention of Jezebel there, but also think about the whore of Babylon, riding the beast. And the fact that Revelation deals with the, antichrists and false messiahs and things that come in, and this Babylon figure who will be drunk on the blood of the saints. Now, again, if you're a Thelemite or an esoteric practitioner, you have a very different understanding of the term Babylon than people would who would just be reading Revelation, perhaps from a conservative Christian viewpoint, for example. It would be very, very different way of understanding Babylon because, and again, I have a podcast on Babylon too, but Babylon really is associated with dissolution. She's associated with kind of the dissolving, she's drunk on the blood of the saints because she's ground up the body. You've crossed the abyss and your identity has been laid waste. You're not... You reach the shining mountaintop. Now it's now you're in the point of dissolving. All the things that you hang on to and identify with are crushed and broken in the wheel, so to speak. Which makes Babylon a figure very similar to Kali and to some of the other ones, because it's about the fact that there's a creative impulse that reaches its peak, and then there's a dissolution and a crumbling. But the Wicked Queen archetype is interesting. You think Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, for example. Or you think about Sleeping Beauty with Maleficent. Now the Queen in Snow White. It's interesting. It called to my mind Anne Sexton's book Transformations. Now Anne Sexton, of course, is a poet. She's written in that confessional tradition that we tend to associate with Sylvia Plath. Again, some of those others who were in that style, and of course, again, Anne Sexton was another one who, unfortunately, brought her life to an end. Just as Plath did, not necessarily, not in the same way, but nonetheless, there was this kind of these female poets who were very much in despair and have become kind of representative of some of the that kind of despair that women carry for various reasons. But she had a collection of poems that were about fairy tales called Transformations, and she does a version of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. In fact, it's the very first one in the book, and in this version, it's all the things that we know that, she wants to be, she looks in the looking glass, wants to be the most beautiful, fairest of all, right? The most beautiful woman. And the mirror tells her this until Snow White comes along, and then they're like, well, she's actually fairer than you. So now it becomes a contest about vanity, about looks, right? I'm going to be the fairest in the land. And it's interesting that there's an evil queen who cares that much about being beautiful. But you think about that, that's the archetype of Jezebel. It goes back to the whole thing of, on her day of her death, she dressed herself up in her most beautiful finery and taunted, her oppressor out the window, yelling at him out the window. And so it's the idea that that person's beauty and how fair they are is actually what the real priority is. In other words, that women who are powerful are driven by vanity. I'm going to be the most beautiful, and that also not to underestimate the power of seduction that you have. That is part of a female's power. That goes back to the archetype of the anima and the way in which the feminine is, can have a almost paralyzing power you can look at the Medusa archetype as well, which is somewhat connected to that, over men that, to kind of put them in a state of where they are almost helpless in the face of the female. So people tend to, and this is, of course, is why love and war often are together. You often see love goddesses that are also war goddesses, because they are, they have this kind of paralyzing power. Carl Jung even said it in his discussion of the anima. The anima injects her poison. It's like there's something that happens there, and that's the way it's perceived. And it's one of those things that, for men, this can manifest in a number of ways if we're looking at it in a negative sense. This is where the woman has the upper hand. This is where the woman can dominate. And so that domination is associated with these queens. Oh, they're obsessed with their looks. They're obsessed with their own beauty and how they have to be the most beautiful, and they will ruthlessly kill anybody who is not, who is their competition, right? But at the end of the story in this one, Snow White marries the poison apple falls out of her mouth. She miraculously wakes up. The prince marries her, another kind of Cinderella-ish type thing. But at the wedding, the evil queen is invited to the wedding feast, and she has these iron-hot shoes attached to her feet, and which they said basically fry her like frog's legs. something I forget what the exact wording is, but her legs fry upward like a frog or something like that, and she's forced to dance herself to death. That's her punishment for what she does, which is really interesting. It's almost like she's immolated at the root. And do you think about the feet and the root? I mean, this is the root of the earth. This is the root of your sensuality, right? You're being burned. You're being dissolved from that. Or even the Wicked Witch in The Wizard of Oz, right? Although in her case, it's water, right? Water gets dumped on her, and then it's just kind of like she just completely dissolves or is annihilated. Like there's some element that they are destroyed by or are returned to in some way. But the idea of, and of course that's more of a Wicked Witch thing, but still, there's this idea of, yes, this, if we compare it to the hero myth, where you'll have a dangerous father or an uncle figure who opposes the hero, now we almost have this idea of the wicked queen who becomes the foil of the innocent and pure and of course very beautiful girl who represents this purity, and this is almost like this aspect of femininity that's corrupting. And that gets me to my last point about this, which is this, what I call, and again, I'm not the one who made this term up, but the virgin whore axis. It's this kind of, it's this spectrum of femininity that defines femininity in terms, in patriarchal terms, which is basically that a woman is defined by her sexuality or how she uses her sexuality, or by her, her level of innocence versus experience. Because obviously we've seen that archetypes of wise women, of witches and things like that, are somehow considered to be evil, or they're considered to be this is where you have these archetypes of this type of feminine that has to be extinguished or kept in its place. And it always tends to be associated with the whore. Okay, I did find it terribly interesting, and again, not to to dip into the political thing, because I know there's some people who are like, I don't want to hear anything more about it. I'm tired of hearing about politics. But and I get it, but nonetheless, I did hear something where people were referring to Kamala in terms that were just really just offensive, because they're just not true. But and again, I don't care whether you like her or not. I mean, they're just flat out not true. But basically saying that she slept her way to the top. Now, but I said that's what they're doing. I said it has nothing to do with the factuality. People who are against her are gonna buy into it because it follows the archetype. It follows that wicked queen archetype. She's the one who's power hungry. She wants power. She's going to be ruthless. She gets her way by seducing people. I mean, and again, there's the whole race issue is yet another thing. But just from looking at it from the point of view of the feminine, I'm like, yeah, that's why they're going to bring that into it. I mean, it doesn't matter that you have another candidate that also has been accused, that has actually been proven to have committed sexual impropriety. Doesn't matter. What matters is that she's not doing that, because basically a woman is judged by her her purity and her chastity. You think about people taking vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, right? It's how well does she obey and how chaste is she? And these are terms that are extremely dated that really have nothing to do with things now. We still do try to attach an importance to them, but you will find that when you're talking about a regime that wants to be very patriarchal, and which also just happens to be at least under the guise of Christianity, whether or not it's truly Christian is yet another a totally different conversation that one could have. But there's just this idea of women as being subject, because the model of femininity in Christianity tends to be the Virgin Mary. And it's a model of someone who is, first of all, who never had sex but did manage to have a child, which is also a mythological motif. And who is threatened. And again, in this case, it's the baby who's threatened, like King Herod threatens Jesus in this case, right? He's sort of the threatened child. But the Virgin Mary is this mother who accepts this annunciation, this conception through God, has this child, and is considered to be kind of this unblemished woman without any sin, which is, I think, if you're a human being, literally impossible, by those standards. But in any case, we go along with the idea that she's this model of purity and obedience, okay, and submission. So in other words, she's not God, but she can intercede because she's, and that's actually what they consider to be the model of queenship too. The very beneficent motherly woman who will intercede on your behalf. But if she's not like that, if she has power in her own right, if she's independent, if she says, no, I'm going to make decisions, and I'm going to make what are difficult decisions at times, and no, I'm not always just going to be nice because I'm female, I'm going to make the decisions I have to make, then she is now she's on the other side of the axis. Because you always find that, how many men has she slept with? Oh my gosh, she's a whore, she's this, she's that. I think I've mentioned this before in Proverbs 5. They talk about the foreign woman, which is also translated as loose woman. Okay, she's a woman who is outside. She's an outsider. She's not following the social norm. She's not staying within the script that's there for her. And then she is therefore someone of quote unquote loose morals. And to a woman of loose morals is equivalent to this threatening, feminine, like wicked queen kind of archetype. And really, wicked queen applies to a lot of people, whether they actually have positions of political power or not. Because if you are a sovereign, if you have sovereignty over yourself, a lot of the fights that are going on right now, like in the U.S., about whether or not a woman has sovereignty over her own body and her own decisions, right? It's about your sovereignty, about you. What kind of rights do you have, or are you expected to be subservient to some other element? And I'm going to say it's a masculine one. I mentioned how people forget it was only in the 1970s that a woman could get a credit card on her own. Okay, because it was assumed that her husband was going to be the one working and she was going to be home with the kids. So she wasn't going to have an income other than through her husband. Okay, nobody wants to go backwards to that. And so it's interesting how we're seeing the rise of this wicked queen archetype coming up again with respect to women. And it's just fascinating to me how the knee-jerk reaction is to go to the same tropes. That's what I've often said when people are insulting and so forth. It's like, what trope do they go for? What's the first thing that you say about that person? What's the first insult you think you can hurl at them? There's where your own sense of where you're threatened by something, or what you're kind of falling into there in terms of maybe what your own biases or what your own prejudices might be in spite of anything else. It can kind of tell you something. If people's knee-jerk reaction is, first of all, they were, well, again, I don't want to get into it, but certainly from the point of view of sexuality, to try to say, oh, she was somebody who slept around. She wasn't good at anything. She just slept around, and that's what she was good at. Like, I remember hearing that, and I'm going, well, first of all, it's just patently not true. I mean, she has a good resume and a track record. Again, whether you agree with her things or not, there's some people who don't like the way she was as a DA. Whatever. I mean, Because in these cases, the facts aren't what are important. What's important to people is that she's following the trope. She's following the archetype. She's one who is going to be vain and putting herself forward and is going to be ruthless and pushing people out of the way of her personal vanity. Because it's almost like they're treating it like a form of hubris. You're a woman, you're supposed to be submissive, and for you to put yourself forward as somebody of power is an act of hubris. Right? That's the way that's being couched. And that's a weird word these days too. But anyway, that's how that's being represented. And the thing is, it's a trope, it's an archetype, but it's interesting because I just find it fascinating how people always with a powerful woman have to turn around and make it about sex. It has to be about sex, sexuality, beauty, and vanity. Because again, that's where a woman's power is assumed to be, is just in her physical beauty. But of course, a woman's power actually it comes in with something much deeper than that. Again, if we look at ideas of Shakti, really even men, the feminine in them is probably the source of their power, which gets back kind of what I was sort of saying earlier about vulnerability. Vulnerability, for somebody who can remain vulnerable and remain independent, that's a strong person. Okay, that's a very hard thing to do. It's very strong, because we often associate strength with this kind of brute force and violence in the way of behavior. But as it's often been noted, that need for brute force and violence, it's like the person who has to surround themselves with semi-automatic weapons. It's like, who's after you? Like, are you Jason Bourne or something? I mean, like, who's after you? Like, why do you need this much to protect yourself? It's a sign of fear, and it's generally a sign that one feels that they're weak. They're so weak that I have to use violent force against the people around me. Now, with respect to Jezebel, if we want to assume that the stories about her are true, and we don't actually know, the historicity of it doesn't seem to add up. But if we want to assume that those stories about her are true, then I have to say, okay, she is a woman who comes from a society where she had more equality or more rights in terms of rulership, where she's taught a certain form of rulership that is probably still more patriarchal, moves into a society that's a bit more patriarchal, where she's not considered to have a prominent role, and or she's not supposed to. Generally, like the queens are considered to be more submissive or subservient to the king, but she takes on a role that is not traditional in that sense, and she's fighting in the way that the people in that society fight. She's it's the old "when in Rome, do as the Romans do." She's within that system. That's what they've learned, and that's how they do it. Okay. So she's fighting, she's kind of doing things according to that system. And similarly, I feel like when women are seeking their own sovereignty and their own empowerment, that's the way other women do it too. It's like, okay, I'm going to do it by lashing out. I'm not going to be vulnerable. I'm not going to be sweet. I'm not going to be nice. And that's often what people associate with the dark feminine, just like we talk about the evil queen. But again, it's a response to the environment and the culture that you're in. It's got to be more than, it's not a matter of, women have to go back to being, like, I'll hear that a lot. Like, I'll read Esther Harding and some of these other writers who will say, well, even women don't behave in a feminine manner. And I'm like, well, what exactly do we mean by that? Do you mean not in a submissive manner? Or not in this kind of, chastity and obedience kind of manner? Or is it just a matter of we're not respecting the complexity of what femininity is? And that femininity also has to be brought out in the masculine as well. Men should be able to have that femininity as well. And I don't mean that means that men have to do what women do. That's not what that means. Yet the feminine power within the man is actually, that's really a very potent source. And a man who's comfortable with his femininity is an incredibly powerful man. Similarly, a woman who is comfortable with all aspects of herself is a very powerful woman. But that would mean, in spite of the attacks and how people are, that you can still move about freely with an open heart. And again, that same would be true of men. That would be the ideal state. But it's not, the construct isn't there. And I feel like pointing to someone like Jezebel as some kind of a villain or a wicked queen, I feel in some ways what she embodies is that woman seeking her power within a structure where she probably, even for her royal status, may have been a little more of a second-class citizen. I find it interesting that she is the aunt of Dido, Queen of Carthage, because Dido was a very powerful queen, brought down really, after Aeneas leaves her, right? And, offing herself after Aeneas leaves her. And that's one of the main plot points of the Aeneid, and the way that she felt betrayed by him. So in a way, it's almost like saying, yes, she's also part of that, sovereign, but instead she's brought low because she falls in love with a man, and then she gives up her sovereignty in that way. And because of her awareness of that, then she almost kind of does what Ajax does. It's almost like the feminine version of that. She doesn't fall on her sword. She, does away with herself in a different way. But just the idea of feeling that they've betrayed what their own nature is with regard to that. So, I don't know. Fascinating stuff. But if we look at the archetypal associations with Jezebel, and again, of course, in feminist reinterpretations, people will try to reclaim a lot of that, and maybe so. But it's also interesting to understand the ways in which the evil queen is actually the reflection of a woman trying to maintain her archetypal status in a world where she is not considered to be, where she is not considered to be a dominant being. She is not equal, and she is not dominant. Okay. And so, a lot to think about there. This was an interesting one to do. Thank you guys so much for listening. If you did enjoy this episode, like I said, please, if you are on YouTube, please give it a like, subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell. Subscriptions move up very, very slowly on Chthonia. And it would be nice to see those spike up at some point. If you're listening to this on Spreaker and you don't subscribe, then do consider subscribing to the podcast. If you do want to support the work that I do on Chthonia, you can visit patreon.com/Chthonia if you did want to become one of my supporters. Supporters do get extra podcasts, additional updates, and other things that I don't always necessarily share as part of my regular work, and share a lot of that stuff with my patrons as well as kind of exclusive content, and of course early access to episodes and things like that. So you can check that out if you're interested. People can also become free members, and I do post some things for the free members as well. And if you want to follow me on social media, it's Chthonia Podcast, one word. I do a live stream most Mondays. Sometimes I have to postpone them for various reasons, but most of the time it's around Mondays, noon Eastern time. And I also will post, again, podcast updates, other stuff that's going on. You can check out Chthonia Podcast, one word, on Instagram and X. I'm barely on X, but, I do post the podcasts there. Two words on Facebook. And again, it's at Chthonia Podcast, one word, on YouTube. Shows up just as Chthonia. And I should also always forget to mention that I have a merch store. So if you want to check in the description below, whether it's for the podcast or whether it's for on YouTube, I do have a spring.com store with Chthonia merch with the Chthonia logos, which are super cool, designed by a very good friend of mine. And so if you want to get your hands on any of that merch, that is available too. Thank you guys so much for listening, and we'll catch you in the next episode.